when you focus a lot on authoritarian regimes, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you focus a lot on authoritarian politics, it's very easy to get very concerned about some of what we see happening here. But we have seen somewhat of an attempt to rewrite history in real time here, recent history. There are very credible reports that people joining the current administration are being asked what happened on January 6th.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, a contributor to the Bulwark and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and I'm joined from his beach hideaway by Eliot Cohen, the professor emeritus of strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a contributing writer to The Atlantic magazine. Eliot, how are you? Are you enjoying Rehoboth?
Well, Rehoboth is lovely. There's great ice cream. There's Thrasher's French fries made from 100% peanut oil, but it's raining now. So, and in any case, I'm focused on Shield of the Republic. Last week, Eric, I suggested we introduce a new segment on the latest jackassery of the Trump administration. That is to say, not the things that they were doing that were just really dangerous, malevolent, cruel, and destructive, but things that really kind of showed them up for what they are. And I got a lot of very positive feedback, particularly about the word jackassery, which really does seem to conjure something up. I was originally going to talk about Steve Witkoff's interview with Tucker Carlson, in which, for those of us who are connoisseurs of the species that Lenin referred to as useful idiots, was really kind of a master performance. I think, even Dmitry Medvedev or Sergei Lavrov in their occasional sober moments would appreciate it. But that's all been blown out of the water by an amazing event, which is that my boss at the Atlantic, and I'm not just sucking up to him, Jeffrey Goldberg, was put on a Signal chat by the National Security Advisor, which included the Secretary of Defense and various other worthies, planning the strikes on the Houthis. And he's written it up in a great piece in the Atlantic. And, it strikes me that really it's actually not the way the government should transact business over Signal.
Do tell.
I've somehow, I mean, you would be the expert, but I don't think Dick Cheney would have done this. I don't think John Rumsfeld would have done this. They might even have gotten somewhat exercised if someone did. But enlighten me, please.
I mean, it's hard because I'm still trying to get my jaw off the table. I mean, I read the piece. Look, we all make mistakes. I mean, it's lore in my family that on one occasion when I was trying to, text somebody, this isn't the first Trump administration. I was trying to text someone a particularly, I thought, vicious takedown of, but appropriate, of Seb Gorka, and autocorrect had changed it to Sex Gorka, and I had somehow rather than copy our intrepid producer, Robert, I had copied Robert Zellick, who got back to me and said, "This is a very interesting article, Eric, but I'm not sure why I'm included." And all the rest of my family members were just, left, kind of confused to try and figure out what the sex part of the article was. But look, this is why actually you do not conduct government business on commercial applications on cell phones, where you have to choose recipients, from your own, phone book. I mean, I suspect this is going to lead to some very uncomfortable conversations in the Trump administration about why Mike Waltz has Jeffrey Goldberg in his, phone directory to begin with, much less to include him on what was described as a Signal Chat Principles Committee meet, which is, I've never, that's something that's just never kind of occurred to me before. Look, there are a couple of things I think, Eliot. I mean, look, this is jackassery of the first order. However, there are a couple of very serious points here. One is that this is a potential very serious infraction of law because it violates the Presidential Records Act, because these things apparently were set to disappear after a certain period of time, and so no record of these official government deliberations and decisions, presumably would exist had not Jeffrey Goldberg preserved them. Second is that this is very bad governance. I mean, the reason why you do these meetings and have records of conclusions, as you know, and not just the conclusions, but also discussion of records of what was discussed by the principals among themselves, is so that you can reconstruct how decisions were made. You can also learn from them. I mean, both the historical record, but even later on in your own administration, you might want to go back and how did we come to that decision? And this has all been violated by the way this was done. And that's not even to get into the substance of what was discussed, which I think is also very, very telling. That that the Vice President of the United States would basically say that maintaining freedom of navigation is not a core national interest, and that the whole thing really is bailing out the Europeans again, and that Stephen Miller would say, yes, but POTUS, that's President of the United States, wants this, but then he wants to go to the Egyptians and Europeans and get paid up, for what we've done, which I think it tells you a lot about both the predatory and transactional nature of this administration.
Yeah, I would add to that a couple of other things to be serious for a moment. In general, people tend to think that Signal is the most secure of the messaging apps. I believe there have been stories that have come out which suggest it may not be entirely secure, which shouldn't surprise anybody. I mean, these things are always a measure countermeasure game, and I certainly believe that the federal government has the resources to do things in a much more secure way. I think the other thing that comes out in this, and this is to some extent true, I suppose, of all administrations, but more this one, you can see that they're talking about how to manipulate the president, and to try to, they're dealing with his inconsistencies, his pet peeves, and they are, I wouldn't say they're not mocking him by any stretch, but there is a faint note of derision in it. By the way, I completely agree with you about Vance, who I think the more I think about him, the more sinister a figure I think he is. But we can save that for another moment. But I also do think, taking into full account the seriousness of what you said, that it really does make him look like a bunch of dummies.
Yeah,
And
of course.
and in a serious humorous vein, I would also say that, look, we're going to spend a lot of time being worried about them, to some extent even being afraid of them, I suppose. Um, it's also very important to laugh at them because it puts them in the proper proportion. These are not big people; these are little people. And its mockery is good for those of us who are on the other side. It annoys them, which is fine, but I think it also helps keep a sense of proportion. It's the reason why people like Václav Havel or Sharansky, in their times dealing with authoritarian figures, put a lot of effort into very successful humor at their expense. So humor is, in that sense, I think, a serious thing. Speaking of Václav Havel, I think we should get to our guest, don't you?
I think we should get to our guest. We have a special guest today. I'm delighted that she's joined us on Shield of the Republic, Katie Stallard, who is senior editor for global affairs at the venerable New Statesman, and also the author of an absolutely fascinating book, Dancing on Bones, History and Power in China, Russia, and North Korea, which is kind of right up Shield of the Republic's alley because, we love to dig into the deep historical roots of events that we're trying to make sense of today. And Katie, your book helps, I think, do that in terms of the uses of history in Russia, China, and North Korea. So welcome to Shield of the Republic.
Thank you so much for having me. Huge fan. And I feel like the conversations you've been having have been an important source of sanity for so many of us over recent weeks. So thank you.
So, Katie, thank you for that. You've been a correspondent in all of these places, so you've seen these places firsthand and have been a very shrewd observer of them. You want to just say a little bit what the book is about, what the origins of it were, and then I think Eric and I have some questions we'd like to draw you out on, if we may.
Thank you. Yeah, so the book is about essentially how autocrats use history, how they approach history as a tool of regime security, and how it functions, particularly in the cases of Russia, China, and North Korea, to help the current leaders stay in power. So this really comes out of my own experience as a reporter, based first in Russia, then in China, but also then having the opportunity to report on and from North Korea, and really seeing the power of these historical narratives up close. So the book focuses in particular on the Second World War, although I also look at somewhat at the Korean War in the context of China and North Korea. And it really started with these experiences for me reporting in the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I was based as a foreign correspondent in Moscow, starting in 2013, and it spent a lot of time traveling backwards and forwards from Russia to Ukraine, and then reporting from Crimea during the Russian annexation and subsequently the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And what really struck me and prompted the idea for this book was this sense of almost moving between these two parallel realities. When I would be in Ukraine on the ground, I would see things with my own eyes. I would talk to people, we would document what was happening there, and then we would go back to Russia. And when you switched on the TV, you would just see this black is white version of what was happening. And people would tell you, on the pro-Russian side, for instance, in eastern Ukraine, who were watching a lot of Russian television, were absolutely convinced that fascists had seized control of Kyiv, that this was an American and British orchestrated plot to topple the legitimately elected president, install these new, unwanted, unelected leaders, and turn the country into this puppet administration. And there were, yes, there were certainly paid Russian soldiers, but there were also volunteers, both from the Russian-speaking regions and from Russia itself, who were coming into Ukraine to man checkpoints, pick up guns, stand against these fascists who were supposedly marauding through the country. And the reference that you heard over and over again was the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War. I was really struck by how many people would put this in the context of, we are standing against fascism now, as our great grandfathers and our grandparents did during the Second World War, which was how this was being framed on television. So it was very striking how resonant that period of history was in the current war, and how the version of history that you understood and the sort of information environment that you're steeped in determined how you saw the present day. And then I moved to China from Russia in 2015. And one of the first big assignments I did was the Victory Day parade there to mark the end of the Second World War in Asia in August of 2015. It felt very familiar to what I had just been seeing in Russia. These sort of huge military parades through Red Square was happening now through Tiananmen Square. Putin was there alongside Xi, watching all the intercontinental ballistic missile launchers and the tanks and the combat helicopters passing over central Beijing. And it felt like something that must always have happened, that this was a tradition dating back to the end of that war. But in fact, that was the first time that parade had ever happened in China. It was this new holiday. It was part of 3 new holidays that Xi Jinping had introduced as part of this real effort to focus on the commemoration of the Second World War and the Communist Party's version of history. So that started this process for me of then tracing back, how has this history been commemorated, featured in these countries over the 7 decades since the end of the war? How is it portrayed now? And why does that matter? What does that mean for these countries' foreign policy, how these countries' citizens are told what's happening, what the leadership is defending them against, why they need, in both cases, this strong central leadership to defend them from these external threats. And then I also started reporting somewhat on North Korea and just felt like, well, this is just the nth degree example of how history can be resonant and important in the current day. When you go to North Korea, it is impossible to miss all of the commemoration, the statues, the narrative of the end of the Second World War, in the sense that people there are told that it was actually the current leader's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, who liberated the Korean Peninsula at the end of that war, and who then, in the official version of history, defended the country in the Korean War that followed in 1950. Although, of course, as we know, in real life, Japanese colonial rule ended because of the Japanese defeat in 1945, and it was the North that attacked the South at the start of the Korean War, not the other way around. But that period of history has really become front and center of the justification for why the Kim regime still needs to be in power, and why, in the current example, they need to spend so much money in a country with such scarce resources on developing the nuclear arsenal, the means to deliver it, and why, so many years after the end of that war, it's still so central to the regime's narrative. So this was an attempt, I guess, to understand the backstory to what I was witnessing in real life on the ground, and to understand how we got there. What I did not expect when I finished writing this book and moved here to the United States was for any of this to have any sort of resonance in our contemporary in our contemporary politics. So it is stunning and somewhat dismaying to see some of the types of ways of talking about history that I cover in the book start to rear their head again here.
There's so many fascinating angles of this. One of them is, of course, and there are all sorts of ironies in how they're handling history. And you point out in the book, so the Chinese communists now make a big deal of World War II. Actually, truth is, the Chinese communists did not do a whole lot against the Japanese. Most of the fighting is the civil war against the Kuomintang. But now, of course, they're making the Kuomintang heroes in a certain way of that story. So that's one irony. On the Russian side, it was the Ukrainians who suffered most, actually, from Hitler's invasion. It was Ukrainian soldiers, including Ukrainian generals, who were kind of the cutting edge of the Red Army. And more importantly, if you want real neo-Nazi movements, you can find plenty of genuine neo-Nazis in Russia. So there's lies, there's distortion, there's inversions of reality. One question I have for you is, okay, the World War II is now 80 years ago. The living memory of it is basically gone. I think the last Spitfire pilot, the Battle of Britain, just died. But basically, the living memory of the war is gone. Do you think that there'll be a sort of a diminishing utility for the World War II in terms of the cohesion or the propaganda and mobilizing effect that autocrats are looking for, or is this, will this be the gift that keeps on giving to them?
I think actually one really sad way to look at this is, once you lose the real people and the lived experiences of what those wars actually involved, that can be something of a gift. One of the issues in Russia, for instance, and one of the controversies that I researched for the book, was this sense among the relatives of the veterans and the people who had actually fought and died during that war, were sort of reacting to Putin's shifts and the way that he had made the May 9th, the Victory Day celebrations, such this bombastic, militaristic occasion. And some of the relatives of real veterans felt that they were losing the real people and the real stories and the tragedy and all the suffering that was involved in that day, and turning it into this big sort of pomp and ceremony filled event. And they started, a small group of journalists actually started this, what they intended just to be a very small grassroots alternative called the Immortal Regiment, where the idea was, instead of the great big Victory Day parade in Moscow and the various offshoots across the country, they would just march quietly holding portraits of their own relatives who had fought in the war. And if people didn't have a personal connection, they could choose to hold a portrait of someone else. And the idea was to put these people and their stories back into that day, which, to their great surprise, became tremendously popular. There were suddenly tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people taking part in these marches across Russia, because there was this real appetite to remember that aspect of the war and, the real heroes and the real suffering that had been involved. So, of course, the Kremlin could not allow that to stand. This movement, the Immortal Regiment, was co-opted. A close loyalist of the Kremlin set up an alternative movement called the Immortal Regiment of Russia, which branded itself the same, set up its own marches, and then became something that now Putin marches often at the front of, carrying a picture of his own father. And it was one of the organizers of that initial movement who gave an interview, describing his real dismay at how their own movement had once again been co-opted and turned back into exactly everything that they didn't want it to be. And he appealed to them to just please stop doing this. And he said, this turns into dancing on bones. So I think there is this real tension between actually remembering the war and commemorating the war and honoring the real people who took part in it, and then an official, very mythologized, stripped down, idealized version of that war, which is this sort of, square-jawed, heroic soldiers striding forward to endless victory, and which, it's a very glorious, very attractive story, but it's just a story. And once you take the real people out of it, it's hard to get that detail and get back all of the nuances and the shades of grey. And I think, crucially, the historical lessons of that war. If you only remember wars as being these great, victorious, affirming achievements, then it's great for rulers, people like Putin, in generating support for the idea of waging wars. But it loses the sense of the suffering and the real tragedy that comes along with it.
One of the things, Katie, that's really fascinating about your account of how the war has been seen in Russia over time, because it's the notion of a great patriotic war was something that Stalin created at the time to mobilize enormous numbers of Russians to go and fight, because they were, Russia had just enormous numbers of men under arms to fight World War II. In the post-war, you point out that his record was a little shaky, actually, and that this becomes a part of Khrushchev's effort at de-Stalinization and the so-called thaw, where he criticizes Stalin for having purged the officer corps in the 1930s before the war began. I think there's discussion then of Stalin's, mysterious absence in the first days of the war after the breakdown of the Hitler-Stalin Pact and Operation Barbarossa gets rolling. And that all sort of gets shut down when Brezhnev comes to power. There's put an end to all of this openness until Gorbachev comes around and opens things up again in the period of Glasnost, which happens to be a period when I was serving at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And there was one wag who said the thing about Russia is it's a country where the past is unpredictable, because you had suddenly this opening of archives. You had people like General Dmitry Volkogonov writing real, sort of attempt at more honest military history of what had happened, very critical of Stalin, recognition for the first time of the Hitler-Stalin pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, what happened at Katyn with Polish officers. And then the rise of Memorial, which you talk about, which was an organization that was intended to actually document the repressions of Stalin and the victims of Stalinism. And now Putin has shut that, all down. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of waxing and waning of the Great Patriotic War in sort of Russian thinking and iconography?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that Stalin, very soon after the end of the war, actually cancelled Victory Day. So in 1947, there was a short notice in the newspapers with no explanation that just said Victory Day will now be a normal working day. And there was this very real sense immediately after the war, to your point about what happens when you lose the living memory, the country was absolutely devastated. It had suffered, I think it's often maybe doesn't get quite enough attention in Western narratives of the war, just the sheer scale of the losses and the suffering in the Soviet Union. And you're absolutely right to point out that very much includes Ukraine. I think Putin likes to elide the Soviet Union and Russia, but so many of those losses and that fighting was borne by what is now modern day Ukraine. But Stalin really was concerned about the war heroes coming back, demanding, particularly the great generals who had fought in all these famous battles, who had actually marched to Moscow, coming back and potentially being a threat to him. So it's quite striking how quickly he moves to sideline them, how much supervision and scrutiny there is of returning officers and whether they're politically reliable or whether they might be a form of challenge. I think he's very aware of the previous examples, as I think Putin is now, incidentally, of what happens when you suddenly demobilize hundreds of thousands of soldiers returning from the front. And he wanted to make sure that they were not a threat to his own regime and to his own security. So he really downplays the war. And there's this example, I think in 1947, so just 2 years after the end of the war, front page example on the anniversary of Victory Day of a returning soldier who has gone straight to work at a collective farm and who is now devoting his energies to working for the advancement of socialism, which is the model people are expected to follow. It is, don't expect to rest on your laurels. One of his senior advisors, Zhdanov, who's very involved in the propaganda messaging, sends out a directive that says that editors are to dispel this idea that people should take some time to rest and to recuperate from the war, that there are these urgent tasks facing the country now. So people are basically to get on with life and get back to work. And it's only once Khrushchev is in power that it is possible to have more of a reckoning with some of the great mistakes that were made, some of the strategic blunders, some of the orders, questioning how many of those losses were the result of very poor strategy. And as you say, the purges of the officer corps on the eve of that war. So there is a chance under Khrushchev to look at this in some detail, but that is shut down again when Brezhnev comes to power. So Brezhnev brings back Victory Day. He institutes patriotic education, which actually is happening at a time when Vladimir Putin is just starting at high school. So he describes himself as a recipient of this patriotic education and a highly successful product of it. And there's then this real period during the Brezhnev time that people talk about as the cult of the Great Patriotic War, where all of a sudden, 20 years after the end of the war, you have this great effort to memorialize, to build statues, to create the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier that I think people will have seen outside the Kremlin wall in Moscow. And to shift, there's this very telling sort of visual metaphor that happens during that period where they transport a portion of the eternal flame that has previously been burning in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, previously in honor of the martyrs and heroes of the communist revolution, which is transported to Moscow to this new Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And it's this almost literal passing of the flame of legitimacy from the Bolsheviks and the original Soviet heroes to the Great Patriotic War. And this event that really has this resonance, and a genuine popular resonance, in a way that, more slogans of Lenin and now, more complicated references to Stalin are really struggling with. So the war is it's the event that these leaders, or particularly in Brezhnev's case, sees on, I think, as a really a lack of great alternatives, which also, in his case, he has fought himself, albeit in a very peripheral capacity, but he lays claims to that. The story of his own war-fighting escapades is rewritten into this sort of extraordinary, brave, Saving Private Ryan style story, to the point where there's then this joke that goes around of, where did you serve during the war? Were you fighting at Malaya Were you fighting at Malaya Zemlya, which is this very small unknown battle that Brezhnev took part in, or were you just sitting around in the trenches at Stalingrad? So it's almost kind of funny how much he inflates his importance in the war, but the messaging is really striking in the context of what's happening now. Of, this was this time of great national effort, when we achieved this extraordinary victory, and which we owed to having strong leadership, everybody working together, and getting behind the leaders of the day. And you're right that then falls out of favor with under Gorbachev. I think the sort of common theme is that it doesn't survive a huge amount of contact with truth and scrutiny. So when you have Glasnost and the ability to access the archives, and this real effort to dig back into the Stalinist repressions and the terror and the suffering, it is hard then to maintain the sense that this is this unalloyed, glorious victory. And I think the way Gorbachev talks about it in one of the Victory Day parades that he presides over is this sense that this is the greatest and most important of our holidays, but also the most tragic.
Thinking about this, Katie, what strikes me is, one of the reasons, as I've always understood, that the Soviet Union in its latter decades turns to the cult of World War II is because the system is not really achieving in other respects, and people are beginning to realize that life in the West is a lot better. And I think there's something similar that goes on. I mean, correct me if you think this is not correct, not right. There's something similar in the other cases too, with North Korea and with China. You fall back on these cults of history, of a very kind of distorted and one-sided history, when the other things that you would normally be very proud of aren't going to work anymore. And I guess what it seems to me is that these are, they are in some ways sources of strength. And you describe, and we've seen in other cases, the North Koreans, kind of do get brainwashed into this cult, but it also leaves them weak and vulnerable in a different way as well. And I wonder if you could, really now drawing more on your observations as a journalist than as an historian here, tell me, is that the case? Do you see this as also kind of a vulnerability? I mean, it would be as though, the United States were still making a cult of the Civil War, which people did for quite a while, to be clear, because there wasn't anything else to talk about, the opening of the West or, you name it.
I think I'm trying to remember the great quote from Timothy Snyder on the past as this misty cemetery of memorials, which are just a little out of view and a little hard to make out, is how these regimes treat this history, that it's not history as it actually was. It's this slightly blurry, difficult to get into the details of a grand story of what happened. And it is both, I think, the contemporary resonance of this, and, talking here candidly in America, is it is this broad appeal to a time, an unspecified time that no one can quite put their finger on, when the country was great. So it's both this sense of past greatness as present, past greatness as like historical determination. We are a great country. Putin talks about this as soon as he comes to power at the turn of the millennium, his first Victory Day parade. He talks about the war in the sense of, we are a great country. We have always been a victorious country, and we will always be a victorious country. That because, in no small part, of the victory in the Great Patriotic War, Russia has always been and will always be a great power, that you can't take that history away from the country. So I think at a time when there is current suffering or struggling, and at that point, that's a time when Russia is just emerging, as you both know well, and Eric, you experienced some of firsthand from the humiliation and the very real difficulties and the turbulence of the 1990s. And this sense of having had this great empire collapse and the curtain being pulled back and seeing how the rest of the world was living, I think to have this new young president coming to power and saying, look, despite what you see around us now, we always have been, and we always will be this great nation. I think that's the sort of intoxicating side of these historical myths.
This is what some of my Foreign Service colleagues, at the embassy in Moscow over that period used to describe as post-imperial stress syndrome, which has the, wonderful acronym that allows you to say that as a result, a lot of people in the country were pissed off.
Right.
You have a fabulous quotation, Katie, from Alexei Navalny that I think speaks to this, what we've been talking about, which is that the focus on the past displaces thoughts about the future and questions about the present. And it's a way, in some sense, of shutting down criticism of the system and the regime. You quote as well Xi Jinping's exhortations when he comes into power against historical nihilism. I mean, obviously, after Mao's death, there is a certain amount of people going back and looking at the Great Leap Forward, looking at the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, all the incredible turmoil that created, and enormous loss of life that ensued from this. So Mao's legacy is, pretty negative in a lot of ways. I mean, yes, he made China stand up, as he said in 1949 when he comes into Beijing. But on the other hand, the cost of China standing up has been just enormous loss of life. And so there's this effort to sort of use these, this history to shut down whatever anybody might have in the way of criticism. Is that fair as a kind of theme that you develop in the book?
Yeah, I think the common theme and the real danger of this approach is this sense that it's patriotic or unpatriotic to remember different versions of history. So I think what they have in common, and what we hear some talk of now, is this idea of it being unpatriotic to look at the dark areas of history. Putin, when he's bringing back some of the Soviet symbols, talks about this moment of sort of apparent frustration. Is there nothing to remember from the Soviet past but the prison camps and the Stalin repressions? Didn't we also have the great space program? Didn't we also have the victory in the Great Patriotic War? And he sets this tone, which is really has become extremely hardline since the invasion of Ukraine, that it's unpatriotic if you try to go back and look at the darker aspects of history, that it's really only traitors and people who hate their country who would want to focus on these darker episodes. You have this incident in the mid 2010s with Putin's culture minister Vladimir Medinsky, who's actually cropped up periodically in the negotiations with Ukraine, who is taking to task. There was a great big budget film production movie called Pamfilov's Men, based on this story from the war that this small tank unit outside of Moscow was hopelessly outnumbered, but decided to stand their ground. And they have this very famous phrase that there's nowhere to retreat. Moscow is behind us. And by the end, they're throwing Molotov cocktails into the tank tracks and single-handedly halting the German advance, which turns out not to be true. Material emerged from the archives that this was in fact a very enterprising journalist who'd been sent out to speak to people on the front lines and discover interesting material to boost morale. And it is acknowledged in the archives that this is not a true story, not least because some of the men actually survived and were around to tell their stories afterwards. But the attitude of Putin's culture minister is that it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. It's too important to Russia's story to be questioned. So he says that anybody who questions it should be sent back in a time machine to sit in the trenches themselves, and should be relegated to suffer in history. So there's this sense that even if it's not true, and there's a very similar incident that happens in China, where even when these stories are found to not be true, they're too important, they're too powerful to be challenged and to be relitigated. And it's only people who are untrustworthy, who are traitors, who don't want the best for their country, who would revisit that.
You have there's another quote in the book, this time from Vaclav Havel, which I was wondering if you might comment on, which is related to what you were just saying. It's because the regime is captive to its own lies, it must falsify everything. It falsifies the past, it falsifies the present, and it falsifies the future. And I guess that what it seems to me is that on the one hand, I think to all of us this seems sort of terrifying. The idea that it's Orwellian, right? It's out of 1984. That if you control the past, you can control the present and thereby the future as well. But actually, it seems to me, what this is part of is these regimes being grounded on falsehoods, which sooner or later cripple them in one way or another, and cripples their leaderships. Now, I mean, is that too rosy a view, or do you think this can just go on forever?
I think that is true. It's just a question of how much time and how much damage in the process. One of the ways I came to think about it was less that this is, for some people, this is very effective. You have true believers who, learn this version of history at school, read it in books, watch it in on the movie screen, and come out of that believing this is a tremendous, glorious country that can do no wrong, and personally feel patriotic. But I think for the vast majority of people, it's more a way of controlling the discourse and commanding obedience. So it's less that people necessarily believe everything that they're required to say in public about these periods of history, and more that it's a way of showing that they support those in power. And you see, I don't want to be overly hysterical about it. I think we've both talked separately offline about, when you focus a lot on authoritarian regimes, to hammer everything looks like a nail. When you focus a lot on authoritarian politics, it's very easy to get very concerned about some of what we see happening here. But we have seen somewhat of an attempt to rewrite history in real time here, recent history. There are very credible reports that people joining the current administration are being asked what happened on January 6th, who won the 2020 election. So it's less that when you repeat a version of history in public, that means you believe it. It's more just that you understand that's what you need to say to get ahead. So I think the dangerous thing and the weakening thing, to get back to your somewhat optimistic view that I agree with, is that one of the weaknesses of these regimes is that when you do have to repeat those lies, and when you can't talk about all the things that actually were disastrous about past offensives and some of the lessons that you might want to learn now, that does make them weaker. That is a strength of democratic systems and the ability to fairly and fearlessly delve back into the past and the historical archives and challenge official versions of event and find where things went wrong and where there were horrific events and where there were genuine tragedies. That's a real strength of a system with freedom of expression, free press, fearless scholars delving back into history. So it is a weakness when you don't allow that, and when you require people to just repeat a story that isn't true. But in the short term, I think that can be a very, very powerful mechanism of control.
Well, let me just follow up one thing, and this is, I think, particularly relevant to the Russian case. I think a point you make, Peter Pomerantsev has made it, others, that part of what totalitarian propaganda tries to do is not necessarily persuade you; it tries to turn you into a nihilist and don't believe anything's true. That's on the one hand. Then on the other hand, they're trying to sell you this picture of the glorious struggle, whether it's World War II or the Korean War, and somehow the assumption is that stuff you'll believe. Your kind of thoroughgoing skepticism about everything else, or nihilism about everything else, that will not somehow bleed over. But I can't believe that that's true. I mean, maybe it does. Maybe human nature can work that way, but it seems to me improbable.
I think the two things can be true at the same time. So I think one of the cynicism and this sort of sense of nihilism is absolutely essential in autocratic systems. This sense that there's no objective fact, there's no point in resisting, there's nothing you can do to change the system. The people in power are all as bad as each other, and it doesn't matter what we, the little people, do. And for a long time, that was the strategy in Russia, was basically leave it to us, you get on with your lives. And this won't affect you. It's since there have been these what Putin perceives as external threats or changes in the immediate outlook. So you see a particular shift after the color revolutions, but somewhat the start of the shift, the color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia. But it's really after the Arab Spring, and when you start to also see these mass protests then in Russia around the rigging of the parliamentary elections in the winner of 2011, 2012, and then his own return to power in the spring of 2012, that Putin becomes very concerned with this idea that color revolutions, which he absolutely insists are organized by the West, it can't be a spontaneous grassroots event, are coming for him. And he really starts to turn up the volume on ideology. There's much more of an effort to talk about this idea of a fascist threat and this sense that there is some external peril that's coming for Russia. And he starts to really position himself much more clearly as this defender of the fatherland. He does these big rallies where he talks about the history of the war and says, we are the current defenders of the fatherland. So I think as where he was his first decade really wanted people not to get involved in politics at all and didn't want to sort of excite the masses, as he becomes more concerned and as he cracks down in his second decade, there is then much more of this effort to not necessarily, I think rally around the flag is too simplistic. It's more rally around the idea that there is a necessary, strong and central leadership which is defending this country from these evils abroad. And he, I think the cynicism and the part of that survives is this sense that you can't affect the outcome. And I think, again, it's one of the things that is why he has targeted organizations like Memorial and why he has really targeted independent Russian journalists and scholarship, is because if you can't read and see and hear the stories of other people who are standing up to this and pushing back, then it is very easy to believe that there's nothing you can do. All you can do in this system is just keep your head down, look after your family, do the best for your own children, try not to get in trouble, because what good does it do if you go out into the streets and burn down your own life? There's this phrase you hear all the time of we're small people, you're a small person. There's nothing you can do. But I think that can coexist with this. I think where the history and the history of the war is important is this sense of who we are as people, as individuals, as citizens. I think, it's certainly something we're also doing in democratic countries, is absolutely telling ourselves a very idealized story of who we are, what kind of people we're descended from, what kind of things our countries have done in the past. I think it's something we've been doing as long as humans have been living in groups, is telling ourselves stories about who we are, what unites us, and who are our threats, who are the people and the outsiders that we're against. So I think you can both have this quite abstract, mythologized version of the past that does tell this quite powerful, quite appealing story about being fundamentally great people on the side of the good, on the side of heroism, and the sense that there's nothing you can do about the politics of the current day. You should stay at home. You should not get involved. You should not put your head above the parapet. But we're all descended from greatness. It's something that we absolutely do. Across political systems. I think the difference is that in autocratic regimes, you can't push back against that, and you can't say, no, this story is actually considerably more complicated. These wars were not unalloyed, glorious victories. There was a great deal of suffering and struggle too. The final point I would make on that is just, I think there is also, a common feature between Putin and Xi Jinping. This is within his first weeks of taking power as the general secretary of the Communist Party, really puts a lot of emphasis on ideological education. I think he feels that the party has become, corrupt, distanced from the lives of everyday people. They've been buoyed along by this extraordinary economic growth, and they've sort of lost a sense of what they stood for. And he does wage this campaign, which is still very much in force now, against historical nihilism. His theory of the Soviet collapse is that it was largely the collapse of ideology. It was he talks about the denial of history, the attacks on Lenin and Stalin, this tearing down of the pillars of legitimacy for why the Communist Party was in power. And he makes that an urgent priority. These officials up and down the country are issued with this directive that instructs them to go out and struggle, wage these fierce battles in the ideological sphere to regain control of the ideological environment, and to put a lot of emphasis on education, which is the same thing you hear from Deng Xiaoping. The lesson that he takes from the Tiananmen crackdown is that they had, again, they'd allowed ideological education to slip. He talks about the greatest mistake we've made was in the field of education. We didn't tell people enough about the past and what kind of country China was to become. And there is then this nationwide effort to educate people about how the country has suffered, how it was victimized before the Communist Party came to power and wiped away what they describe as this century of humiliation. So I think these narratives of the past serve or are exploited by leaders of the day to tell this story essentially about why they must be in power, what happens if you don't have this strong central leadership, how people have suffered, how they've been victimized in the past. But I don't think that is incompatible with this sense of, but this is out of the hands of the regular citizenry, that you should still be, you should serve your country, you should do your duty, you should be patriotic and do what is asked in these times of great national need. But you shouldn't question the authorities. The big people who are in charge know what they're doing, and this is not something that involves you.
Well, Katie, we've run out of time. I think we could probably go on for another several hours on this subject and others. I do hope that now that you're covering contemporary events here for a UK audience, that we can get you back again, because I think you bring a perspective that some of us who are maybe a little too close to these events, maybe don't really have the distance to be able to appreciate. But I appreciate you coming on Shield of the Public today to share all this with us. So thank you so much.
As do I. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you. I deeply appreciate your clarity and expertise, and I'm just very sorry that any of this is possibly remotely relevant to the present day.
But sadly, it is.